John Pavlovitz describes churches as sprawling collections of a billion imperfections, biases, and wounds, all trying to coexist in close quarters and to hopefully do so in a way that reflects the character of God. I believe this is also a fairly accurate description of the people who make up those churches, you and me and the saints who have gone before us. It's certainly a good description of Moses, which is probably why I like him so much. He was as imperfect, biased, and wounded as I am. And yet, in spite of his flaws, at the end of his days, it was said that never since has there arisen a prophet like Moses, whom God knew face to face. Moses made excuses for avoiding the call of God, claiming he wasn't qualified for the job. But despite his self-doubt and his lack of speaking and leadership abilities, God used him for the greater good. And that gives me hope to know that God can use me in spite of my own insecurities and lack of credentials. Moses complained about his workload at one point, crying out to God, "Why do you treat me this way? Are you so displeased with me that you must burden me with these people? If this is the way you're going to treat me, put me to death at once." And you don't have to be the pastor of a church to have had days like that. I'm pretty sure I'm not the only person here this morning who has had days when everything seems to be going to hell in a handbasket. Sometimes more than days, sometimes weeks or months. Maybe you've even had entire years that felt as if there were no redeeming qualities in them. Maybe you suddenly found yourself dealing with a health diagnosis that you never would have imagined being faced with. Or maybe you've been thrust into the role of caregiver and you feel ill-equipped for it. Maybe through no fault of your own, you find yourself sinking into financial debt. Maybe the love of your life has walked out on you and you can't imagine how you're supposed to carry on. And maybe like Moses, you find yourself crying out to God, "If this is the way you're going to treat me, put me to death at once." And then there was his temper. Moses let his temper get the better of him on more than one occasion. Once throwing a hissy fit after returning from Mount Sinai with God's commandments carved into stone and smashing them into pieces when he discovered the people throwing a party around the golden idol they had created in his absence. And that, believe it or not, is what brings us to this morning's text, in which Moses and God are having a heart-to-heart talk. A few verses prior to this morning's reading, God has told Moses to just go ahead and lead these stiff-necked people to their destination, but God wouldn't be going with them. They were on their own. And in this morning's reading, Moses argues that he cannot lead the people on his own. "If your presence does not come with us, do not send us from this place," he says. Not only that, but he needs to have tangible proof that God will be going with them, pleading, "Please show me your glory." And God's tone seems to soften a bit after Moses' plea. Knowing full well that to look upon God's face would mean certain death because it would be just too much for Moses to handle, God compromises by tucking Moses away in the safety of the crevice of a rock the way a mother might carefully tuck her newborn into a cradle. And out of concern for Moses' welfare, God covers Moses' eyes with God's own hand to shield him from the overwhelming brightness of God's divine presence. And as all of God's goodness passes before Moses, God pronounces God's own holy and sacred name out loud so that it is branded into Moses' memory for the rest of his life. And when Moses hears that name, the words, "I am," spoken in his presence, he comes to a new understanding of God, that being one of grace and compassion. And then after God has passed by, God's hand is removed from Moses' eyes so he can look upon the backside of God, proof positive of God's presence just moments before. Like Moses, when life hits us with all its power, we need more than anything else to know that we haven't been abandoned by God. We need to hear God's name, see God's face, and feel God's presence. When God feels cold and distant to us, we need a new understanding of God, one of grace and compassion. Desperate for that grace and compassion, we cry out with the words of Moses, "Please show me your glory." And though we may not see God in the moment, if we're fortunate, we might catch a glimpse of God's backside. Proof that God's presence was indeed with us and we didn't even know it. Ever wonder what God's backside looks like? When God's hand was removed from Moses' eyes so that he could finally see, Moses saw God's backside. After Moses came out from under his rock, he was able to see the after effects of all of God's goodness as it passed by. What might it have looked like for Moses? And what does it look like for you and me once our eyes are opened to God's goodness? More times than not, we can't seem to see God in the moment, can we? When life is spiraling out of control, we just can't feel God's presence. But after the smoke is cleared and we look back on things, we understand that maybe God was with us all along. That God had not for a moment abandoned us after all. It's a promise that God makes throughout the Bible. In Isaiah, God promised a Messiah whose name would be Emmanuel, which translated means God with us. And the Gospel of John describes Jesus as God's living word, which Eugene Peterson says became flesh and blood and moved into the neighborhood. If we give it some thought, I imagine that each of us could share our own story of times in our lives when God was with us, living within our very own neighborhood and without our even being aware of it, and what the backside of that holy presence has looked like in our lives. One that comes to mind for me was shortly after my arrival at this church almost 18 years ago. I was called by a group of lay leaders, and then within less than a couple years, abandoned by most of them. They who had called me to lead this congregation left it and took their money with them. Attendance plummeted, and it was clear that we could not continue to operate in the red more than 1 or 2 more years. If things didn't change, we would have to close the doors. I felt confused, betrayed, and angry. I felt a lot of things, but the presence of God was not one of them. It was only years later that I was able to see the backside of a God who had been working and walking with me all along. It was only later that I realized the truth of Jesus' words when he pointed out that when new wine is poured into old wineskins, the new wine will burst the skins. God was pouring new wine into the old wineskins of this church, and something had to give. And that something was the former leadership. by sticking around and trusting that God was doing a good thing. I could see from the backside that it was all part of God's plan. From the backside, I could hear the same words spoken from Isaiah. Look, I am doing something new. Now it springs forth. Can't you see it? I'm making a road in the desert and setting rivers to flow in the wasteland. For me, that's what the backside of God's goodness looks like. I hardly ever see God coming to me from the distance, and I almost never can see God at work in the moment of what feels like my undoing. But if I remove the hand from my eyes, I can usually see God's backside, and I can see how God has been active in my life. I can look back and understand how God's goodness was there with me all along, even though it didn't feel like it at the time. And so my word for you this morning is to wait. Wait for the backside, because there always will be one. Your distress and suffering won't last forever. Eventually, it will either pass or ease up in its intensity. And when you look on the backside, I'm betting you'll find that God was there all along, maybe even preparing you for a new thing. Amen.